You're listening to the Real Estate Runway podcast, powered by Quattro Capital, where we are all about alternative business and investment strategies to help you amplify life and maximize wealth. Here's your host, the recovering engineer turned multifamily investor, Chad Sutton.
Real Estate Runway family, we have a very unique guest on today. He is a colleague of Mr. Dan Lewkowicz, who was on, I believe, episode 37. I promised later in the show I'd come back and give that episode number for your reference. But today we're going to talk with an associate advisor or a broker of the Lewkowicz Investment Group who focuses on retail real estate, both anchor tenant and multi-tenant. We're going to compare and contrast multifamily to retail real estate and how you would go about trying to underwrite or investigate one of these deals to possibly invest in or purchase. So stay tuned. Lots of meat in this episode. Here we go. All right, everyone. Welcome to the Real Estate Runway podcast. As always, I'm your host, Chad Sutton. It's a little cold here today in Nashville, Tennessee. For the first time ever, I was in shorts on New Year's Day, 73 degrees. And the next day I was building a snowman with my little girl. So very interesting weather we're having across the country these days. Anyway, I digress. I am here today with Shlomo Aron, who is an associate advisor at the Lewkowicz Group of Encore Real Estate Investment Services. We're going to talk about retail real estate today. But first, before I introduce Mr. Aron to the show here, a little bit about who he is. So he is an associate investment advisor at the Lewkowicz Group, like I just mentioned, and he offers a unique national perspective on commercial investments, as well as a strategic marketing campaign to enable his clients the ability to best achieve the value for their property and advise. And he also advises high net worth individuals, family offices, large trusts, private investors, and such to perfect their investment strategies. Not only does he specialize in real estate, multi-tenant retail property real estate, he is also specializing in cannabis assets and a bit of hospitality as well. So I know we talk a lot about multifamily on this show. I really think you're going to enjoy this episode because it's a little different flavor on the real estate asset classes and you know how they're similar and how they're different. So with that being said, Shlomo, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me, Chad. I'm glad to be here. Doing great. Weather's not so great, but you know you gotta go roll with it. So
that makes sense. And as I understand it, you know, I see some bags under your eyes. If you're on video, you also have a 5-month-old baby, as I have a 6-month-old. So welcome to that club.
Definitely keeping me on my toes. She's keeping me on my toes. But good kid though.
Fantastic. Best kid. Fantastic. Well, if you don't mind, before we get into the meat of the episode, you know, give the listeners an idea who you are. You know, I went a little bit into your background, but I'm sure that won't do it justice. So who is Shlomo Aron?
Yeah, so just briefly, I'm Shlomo Aron. I'm an associate advisor by the Lewkowicz Group of Encore Real Estate Investment Services, and I focus mainly on retail assets. And my background, I started doing accounting actually for multifamily properties. I was doing the bookkeeping for a asset management company that owned a lot of properties throughout Baltimore City and Baltimore County and throughout Maryland. And I was doing basically all their bookkeeping. After that, I started brokering single family houses with a lot of investment properties, fix and flips, all on the single family side. And then I met Dan Lewkowicz through LinkedIn. I took his course and then they offered me a job at Encore. And so that's basically how I got started at Encore. Encore is really, they focus mainly on retail and industrial properties. And I really found my niche within retail with single and multi-tenant assets.
Very interesting. So I love, and so Dan is actually a mentor of yours then. Yeah. Dan Lewkowicz.
Yeah. I would definitely call him a mentor. Definitely learned a lot from him.
Very good. Folks, go back and listen to, in the beginning here, I'll put the episode number that was. I have to go look at what it was, but Dan was on very recently. Fantastic individual. And if you're hearing me say this, you already heard it because you already listened to the beginning of this episode. So no worries. That's already done. Anyway, so the fact that you have seen, you know, multifamily accounting really kind of gives you a unique insight to help us kind of compare and contrast the retail real estate world with what multifamily is. So I think we're going to spend the rest of the time probably talking about, how one would start to look at and evaluate a retail property as an alternative investment strategy. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, just like, let's just jump right into it.
Let's do
I
it.
mean, so when underwriting a retail property, the main stuff you're going to look at is how many vehicles per day are driving past that site, and then the credit of the tenant. Who's the tenant? How long have they been there for? And how many other stores do they own? And so like those are a few stuff, and then you want to look at their financials of the tenant, and then the other part is when you look at a deal with multifamily, it seems like there's a lot more wiggle room. If you're self-managing versus outsourcing your management, you could really save more money on that. So your cap rate there's more wiggle room, as opposed to when you're buying, let's say, a triple net lease, Walgreens on Main Street. Your 5 cap is what you're going to be. That's the return that you're getting. You're going to get that, and you're not going to get a huge tax bill the next year, or insurance. Something's going to go up. There's never going to be a change in what you're getting. So that's kind of the biggest difference I've seen through the underwriting of the retail versus multifamily.
Very interesting. So if I can just pick on a couple of things here to maybe
Yeah.
dive a little bit deeper, let's focus on property taxes first. We'll get to income in a second, because I think that there's a lot that you said there that we really want to kind of compare and contrast. But you mentioned taxes won't really be going up. Are you referring to property taxes? And can you explain a little bit about how property taxes work on, I guess it would be a commercial building, but retail real estate specifically?
Yeah. So when I'm talking about taxes going up, I'm talking about where we have a triple net leased property, and the triple net lease property, the tenant pays for the taxes. And so with the tenant paying for taxes, the landlord doesn't have that responsibility, and he doesn't really need to worry about what's going to happen with taxes.
That's pretty nice, folks, right? I mean, as multifamily owners, we're always trying to predict what the locality is going to do with property taxes and make sure we write our performers accordingly. So the additional question that I know people are going to be thinking here is, the building is what you're buying, not the business, right? So if you're buying a triple net building and you pay more for it than the last guy did, ideally, or he wouldn't be selling, hopefully,
Right.
The property taxes are not actually moving with the sales price, or how are they actually assessing tax? Because it seems like it would be more related to the business than it would be the piece of property. How true is that?
Yeah, pretty much. It does. I mean, it does go on the property. It just doesn't. It doesn't affect the lead when as an investor or as a broker. The way I'm looking at a deal is I'm looking at the tenant. What I'm buying is a piece of paper that says that you're gonna pay me X amount of dollars every single month for the next 10 years or 15 years or however long is left on this lease.
That makes sense. So let's say I go back to the building we're buying. Let's say the previous guy bought a Dollar General, for $10 million. I don't know if that's anywhere near, I'm just using it as an example. And I'm going to pay $20 million for it, right? So let's say that's there's the $10 million gain. Is the local taxing authority likely to change the property taxes they assess on the building, and therefore and the tenant just has to deal with it? Or is there no tax increase whatsoever, on the building itself?
Well, I would say that it would go by the assessment year, what year in the assessment, but yeah, technically the property value would go up.
And the tenant just has to eat that per their contract.
Yeah, per the contract. Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay. Well, that's good to know if I ever open a storefront business.
Yeah, and then the other part is with multi-tenant retail, if it's on a triple net lease, then it will be prorated, so you're not paying. So that could be expense that a landlord can eat given a vacancy.
Given a vacancy, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. That makes sense. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the income side, right? When we're underwriting multifamily properties,
Yeah.
we definitely go through, when we're running our due diligence and even doing upfront underwriting, we're trying to verify what income we think we're going to bring in, and ideally where we can increase rental rates to commensurate with local market for the given property. So for us, that's basically a rent roll and leases that we use to validate what that currently is. Now, you mentioned that you want to look into the credit of the tenant a little bit, right? And you also mentioned that we're kind of buying a piece of paper that says the tenant will pay us this rent for X amount. And these are multi-year leases, by the way, guys. These are not every 12 months like you're used to. Dollar General might be in there for 10 years, or a Walgreens, for example. So you're buying that piece of paper. So but that piece of paper is the business's credit, right? It's their word saying they're going to pay you. So how do you look at these businesses to say, like, let's say it's a T&T nail salon or something like that, right? How do you look at a business and say, do I think they're going to be able to reliably pay me for the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, great question. When you look at these businesses, so there's two there. You can look at their credit rating and see what their credit rating is. S&P, Moody's, and then you can tell based off of that. When you're looking at on a more local level, you're going to want to look at what their sales are. If they report sales, what's the sale? What are the sales on that specific location? And also, how many other locations do they have? If you have every store is low. Every state has, their local stores, and some of them might have 4 stores. Some of them might have 10 stores. Some of them might have 30 stores throughout the state. The more stores they have, the more credible it will be, and the more income that's coming in. So if, let's say, one store isn't doing as well, they have more money to pay it from the next, as opposed to if you have a mom and pop store and this is their only store, if they don't make enough sales that month, you might not be getting your rent check. So that's really that's how you'll look at the credibility, and it's going to affect the value of the property if you have a more risky tenant in there.
That makes sense. And so let's talk about extending that a little bit here. And I do want to come back to lease exposure and vacancy. Let's come back to that in a second. But in terms of, let's say you have a property that has, I don't know, an anchor. You call this an anchor tenant, right?
Anchor tenant, yes.
The major tenants. Let's say it's I'm trying to think of an example. Let's say it's a Publix shopping center or a Kroger or a Walmart, maybe not Walmart.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess Walmart's another good one. But you have that main anchor tenant, and then you have like 7 or 8 small tenants that are attached in a little multi-tenant building attached to the edge of it, right?
Yeah.
So these are small swings, but your major tenant that has 100,000 stores nationwide is probably going to be a pretty safe bet, I would think, like having a Walmart in there. But all the other ones that would go on the side of that, how would you numerically adjust the value? Is there like a rating you assign to it and then it gets a different cap rate, or like how does that work?
For putting on a lease or for putting on for the sale of the property?
The sale of the property. So is that what you were saying, that it affects the price of the lease or the price of the sale of the property?
No, it affects the price of the sale of the property. So I mean, when you have an anchor, we're gonna have less worry about. When you have a national anchor, you're gonna want to have that diversified mix of both local tenants and national tenants. Mm-hmm. So it will affect the price, but you're most of the time you're not gonna have a center that's fully national, that's with all national tenants. There's gonna be some mix. So in regards to pricing on that, again, I would say that it's not going to affect the price when you have multiple tenants. When you have a single tenant on a property, that's when you're going to have you're going to have a really big price difference. I'm advising a client right now who has 2 years left on his lease with a local tenant, and he knows the value of his property, and he's just waiting. He's going to wait out this lease to put a credit tenant in there, and he's going to put this and with a long-term lease. And 2 years from now, he's going to be making at least $2 million more on his property because of that.
That makes sense. So I guess maybe this is a good segue into the lease exposure, right? Because again, on multifamily properties, we look at, a 12-month cycle. You look at, you total up how many leases you have expiring each month, and you look for big spikes. It's something to be aware of. And sometimes, you don't really get this much today, but sometimes that can affect the value of a property. If everything is expiring the month you take over, that's pretty risky, right?
Right.
Because people move. But with multi-tenants, you have several years out. So do you look at the same kind of analysis to figure out when leases are falling out and things of that sort?
Yeah. So that's a great question. It's actually something that is a pet peeve of mine when I receive some underwriting from someone else. When it comes to retail, vacancy factors really shouldn't be a thing, because it's a lease and the lease tells you exactly when it's over. So you can make an assumption for how long it's going to take to release it. But if you have a fully leased property, there's no need for a vacancy factor in it, unless unless you're trying to deduct, like, you're not really, you're not, there's no chance of a vacancy on a 20-year lease for two tenants, one that has 10 years on the lease and one that has 5 years. You, after the 5 years, you put a vacancy for, let's say, 6 months till you release it. But you can't really, there's no point of having a vacancy factor, because it's just not true.
That makes sense. And yeah, for something that's not turning over multiple times in a 5-year period, that would make sense, right? You're not expecting, you might turn over one tenant in your ownership, right?
Right, exactly.
As long as you vet the tenant appropriately, they have a good, good credit rating, they have good, consistent revenue. It might even be worth looking at the industry they're in. Like, is it a cyclical industry? For example, I don't know, give me an example of a business that doesn't do well in different market cycles. Maybe a gym, perhaps.
Well, pretty much every business during COVID had big issues, but yeah. Gyms were shut down during Corona. So I would say definitely, yeah. Any restaurants also got hurt really badly. People don't go out to eat when the economy is not doing well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Well, very good. And so I guess coming back to the risk of a different tenant that we were talking about, is there a methodical way that you would adjust the price based on, so let's take away the anchor tenant. Let's just say we have 3 tenants in a building. One's a one shop mom and pop nail salon. One is a GNC, like a national vitamin brand. And one is, I don't know, something that's, they have 3 restaurants and it's one of 3. Would you be adjusting the price, according to those, and how would you look at doing that? Is it qualitative? Is it quantitative? How would one look at that?
Yeah, good question. You would be, again, you would look at it in the exact same way as looking at a single tenant. We're not going to give as much weight to the tenant that has less credibility, because we're gonna assume that there may be that if times get tough, I as a landlord have no protection if they don't pay their rent.
Okay, so for the riskier tenant, you might assume that income's not there when you're setting the NOI, or discount their rent or something like that.
We're not going to discount the rent. We're not discounting the rent, but we're just going to make the cap rate maybe a few basis points higher, but because
there
of that.
It is. Okay, there it is. So there's a qualitative cap rate adjustment, and of course it comes down to what the market will pay for something like that, right?
Right. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
There's the end of the day, the right price is whoever buys it. So, and that goes across all asset classes.
Sure. That's very interesting. So it kind of gives the listeners some things to think about, right? In summary, your lease exposure is a little different. There really shouldn't be any. You might think about absorption time if you see leases that will expire within your ownership period, and then you're looking at the riskiness or the credit worthiness of the tenant who's backing the paper, right?
Right.
So that's very good. And so for some of our listeners today, the triple net notion might be a little bit new. Can you just give me that basic definition here for triple net and what it means to a property?
Yeah. So good question. When it comes down to leases, you guys have when you look at a multifamily property, you rent out whenever a tenant signs a lease, they're going to sign a gross lease, and however much they're paying you in rent, that's going to cover all the maintenance, utilities. The landlord's paying for insurance and taxes, and for that property. So you're gonna put that into the rent. You're gonna when you assign the rent, you're gonna count. Okay, I have all these expenses. I need to roll that in. When you then there's the nets of insurance, taxes, and maintenance, and those three are going to are negotiable when it comes to retail leases. So there's double net, where it's going to be some variety of the landlord having some responsibilities. Very common, it will be structural issues. Structural issues will fall on the landlord, and maintenance. If the toilet breaks, the tenant needs to pay for it. Then there's triple net lease, which is the best of the best, which is the landlord doesn't have to pay for anything. That if anything ever happens to the property, the tenant has to pay for it. The reason why tenants like this is because they have control of their property. Or Walgreens, they're able to just go build the structure on the property, and they never have to ask the landlord permission if they can redo the bathroom or if they can redo the inside. So that's really why that's why it's a win-win for both. Landlord just gets his his rent every month, and leaves the tenant alone.
That makes a lot of sense. It does. And so for things like you mentioned taxes, insurance, and maintenance, if I'm looking at let's just say, a strip mall or something like that, where there are several, I'm going again to multi-tenant, right? Because I think most of our people would be more into the multi-tenant side, maybe I'm presuming, than an anchor tenant. But in either one of those situations, anchor tenant or multi-tenant, retail real estate, would things like the term that's coming to mind is common area maintenance, right? I think
CAM.
So would this I guess that's contract dependent, but does common area maintenance often fall on the landlord? So things like landscaping, things like lighting in the foyer or something, or the lobby, if there is a lobby, right?
Yeah. So it's good that you picked up on that. That's another source that technically the landlord isn't really supposed to be making income from that, but the landlord will usually pay for that, and then bill that out per tenant, however much square footage. So let's say however much the square footage of the property is, and then let's say however much the bill that monthly bill for common area maintenance is, then you just multiply. You divide that by however much square footage each tenant has, and then they split it up it's called pro rata.
Yeah.
And that's also when you come to multi-tenant. If there's a vacancy, that's an expense the landlord's going to have to eat no matter what.
Very interesting. That makes sense. So triple net is truly everything is billed back to the business and the tenant.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, I think we've beat on income and expenses pretty good here. So I appreciate you doing that. Really, there's not much. I mean, it's effectively, what is your triple net leased income? What is your vacancy, your vacancy coming up? And if you have to account for any, like maybe it takes 9 months, it's not going to take you 30 days, guys, to lease up one of these. That's more like 9 months to a year, I think. Right. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, yeah, I just want to say so I don't remember how it worked in multifamily. I'm pretty sure they needed to give 2 months notice. Mm-hmm. If they're not going to renew. Usually a lot of times
60 to 90 days is
yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. So 60 to 90 days. So usually it will be like 6 months notice, at least. Okay. A minimum of 6 months notice. So that could also affect the pricing if the tenant doesn't need to say when they're going to leave. But usually the tenant has to say a certain amount of time before usually 6 months, sometimes even more. They need to give notice if they're going to vacate the property or they're going to renew.
Okay. So really, when you're drawing out a pro forma, they're pretty simple. It's really what is your leased income? And if you want to account for any periodic vacancy, if there is not overlap and it went from one lease ends to when one begins, and there's really no expenses to look at. How true is that?
Well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, besides for the vacancy, there's gonna be stuff, that the tricky part is, of course, like everything, predicting the future, every pro forma, we can guess what it's gonna look like, but if you have a releasing assumption, you're gonna have to figure that out, and that's always the hardest part.
That makes sense. Okay, very good.
Yeah,
Let's spend a couple of minutes talking financing, and then we'll probably have to bring this one to a close, and I'll let everyone know how they can get a hold of you to learn more. But
yeah.
how are these things usually financed? Is this a Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac thing, bank financing, life company? Like who does this stuff?
Yeah, I usually usually banks are going to do it on that level. Um, in general, you're going to get, yeah, pretty much banks or, local credit unions. That's basically what it goes to. But, you speak to your trusted financial advisor to get the best rates on anything like this.
Okay. So do you typically see, I mean, for example, I'll throw out some general terms, these
Yeah.
days you're going to get your typical 3.5% interest rate. You're going to get a couple of years of interest only. You're going to get a 25 or 30-year amortization, depending on the agency you go with or a
Hmm.
bank. And you're probably going to get about, average 75% on a stabilized property of leverage, right? Now we can
Yeah.
talk about loan to cost construction loans. I don't think those are really a thing here because you're really going to be having the tenant do any improvements to the property that they're going to do their own for their business, right?
Well, it depends. It depends what it is. If we're talking multi-tenant, usually the that's another point that I wanted to mention, that when it's a multi-tenant, there'll be something called TI, which is tenant improvements,
Okay.
and the landlord will give a certain amount of money to the tenant to improve their store if they commit to a certain amount of time on their lease. Where was I going with that?
We were just talking about
Yeah,
financing and whether or not
yeah.
loan to cost loans were really a thing here.
Yeah, so that's where it would come in, if they want to redo the parking lot for a multi-tenant property, that would be, or some type of, or a roof. But then again, that we could also get into the whole development picture of developing multifamily versus developing retail, which is a whole nother topic.
That makes sense. Okay, so
Yeah,
so basically on the as far as the use of leverage goes, then
yeah.
you could maybe get some capex money on a loan. Are you typically going to see about that 75% leverage point?
Yeah, in general, that's pretty much what it is. It depends on the buyer's personal financial statements and the credit of the tenant,
Yeah.
for how risky of a deal this it is. But in general, yeah, it will be something like 75. On a good day, it'll be 80.
Very good. Okay. Well, I've got one more question and then I'm going to have to let you go because I think we could talk all day on this, but I've just so enjoyed, learning here a little bit with our
Yeah,
listeners. So, okay, we've talked through income, we've talked through expenses, we've talked through tenant improvements, we've talked through debt a little bit. And so what would a value add plan look like on something like this? I mean, in multifamily real estate, we wait for a
yeah.
tenant to leave, we improve the property and we lease it up at a higher rate. But how does that work?
Yeah, so a value add for multi-tenant retail would come into play where you have a property where there's leases that are expiring very soon, or there's like 80% vacancy in the building, or a very high vacancy rate, and you just need the right tenant to put in there. Something that we're dealing with right now is where we have this massive shopping center, with a grocery in there, but there's a Kmart in there, and their lease expires in 3 years. So a value add play over here is, you're going to buy it at a discount right now. You wait 3 years, Kmart's leaving, and you could put in there. It's 90,000 square foot place. You could put Walmart, you could put a massive tenant in there, and that's gonna just bring so much traffic to this property. Or you could take something like that and subdivide it and put multiple tenants in there. And another general rule for for retail is that, the anchor tenant is going to be paying less rent per square foot than your smaller tenants.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I could talk to you all day on this, Shlomo, but we're going to have to bring this into an end. Let's quickly get into the Quattro 4 questions that we ask everyone. In this case, what is your superpower as it relates to your business?
So superpower, I would probably say that my super skill would be, just analyzing properties and just really digging into neighborhoods and seeing how, like, what's going to affect the local area. I'm very into geography and, stuff like distance decay. How far is how far are the people from the area, and what's the competition? And so I'll probably say probably my biggest superpower is just, really taking apart deals and figuring out what the best way to go about it is.
Yeah, just some of the terms you use there makes me want to ask you more questions, but I have to refrain. So we're gonna
Well, Google it. Google it.
Google it. Fantastic. All right. What is your biggest failure to date, and what did it teach you?
So one of my early failures that definitely taught me a lot going to the business was, when I was brokering single family homes, I was working with someone that was gonna buy a property, and they gave a full price offer, and something seemed off the way that they were putting it, because I'll just give you briefly. It was a property that the numbers worked for a fix and flip for a BRRRR strategy. For that, basically you rehab it and then you rent it out and then you refinance. But it wasn't going to work for a fix and flip. And he told me he was going to fix and flip it. And we sent in the contract, had everything signed, and then he backed out before he gave the earnest money deposit. And then just and then never called, never responded, nothing. So that was my first lesson. And then my broker at the time, he said, you really have to understand that who you come off to the competition and who you speak to with other people is gonna affect your name. So something that was something that I learned, that you really have to know what people need, and you have to understand that when you represent people, when you say this guy's a great guy, you have to really mean that they're a great person, and you have to really be careful who you are as a person, and what type of name you have for yourself. If you come off as someone that doesn't come through with deals, when you put in an offer, you back out, that doesn't look good for you at all, and it's going to hurt you and your clients as well.
That makes sense. I think you told me at the beginning of this call, as a broker, who you trust affects who trusts you, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. All right. You are the host of a podcast. Tell us about it.
Yeah. So I'm the host of the podcast called Unsolicited Advice. The inspiration for it came because I was driving past a restaurant that had a massive billboard right in front of it. And I just thought to myself, if only I could just give this guy advice to complain to the city to get this billboard down and give the restaurant the proper frontage that it needed. And from there, I just figured I'm just going to start interviewing people throughout the real estate industry and just hear what type of advice they would give to the public. So we usually go through, we talk all things commercial real estate. So I definitely recommend listening to it.
I love it. And Shlomo, I'd love to come on and give some unsolicited advice. So let me know if you need a guest.
Yeah, well, for sure.
Fantastic. And I assume that can be found anywhere podcasts are found, but we will obtain a link
mainly,
to that and put it in the show notes.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Fantastic. Very, very good. Last one. Quattro is very, very big on philanthropy. It is one of our 4 pillars of our company. What philanthropic cause are you behind? Explain it a little bit so that our listeners may perhaps support it on your behalf.
Yeah. So one philanthropy, nonprofit organization I'm very a big fan of, and I give money to is Amudim, and they're a organization that helps people with mental health and victims of abuse, and they support throughout everything. So they support throughout families going through that went through abuse and families with mental health issues. So big fan of it, and if anyone can give, that would definitely be going to the right place.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. Well, Shlomo, I really appreciate you coming on the show, sharing some of your wisdom on retail real estate. I learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners did too. It's always fun when I get to sit here and just ask questions and kind of be a student of my guests. So that was wonderful.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.
And I really appreciate hanging out with you.
Absolutely. And great to meet your little one here as well. You know, you guys won't hear this because we edited it out, but there's a little one who's kind of part of the show today as well. So we'll say hello to him, her. We'll say hello to the beautiful little girl here. And last question, how do people go about getting in touch with you?
Yeah, so reach me on message me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. My name is Shlomo Aron, and I'm all on all three of those. You can send me an email at Shlomo, SHLOMO, at Encore, ENCORE, REIS.com. And you can always reach me on my cell phone, which is 443-430-5473.
Fantastic. And again, all of that will be in the show notes, folks. So don't worry, when you get where you're going, you can absolutely grab that. All right. Once again, I'm the host of the Real Estate Runway podcast. Until next time, over and out.
We hope this episode was insightful and brought value to your day. If so, please be awesome and leave us a 5-star review. Find out how Team Quattro can help you at thequattroway.com. Until next time, this is the Real Estate Runway podcast.